What were your most memorable moments?
In all my years fighting for the freedom of Tibet and the freedom of the Chinese people, I've had many memorable moments. But I think the one that will always stick in my mind is my second trip to Tibet in 1995. I went to Kham province in eastern Tibet because it was the Khampa soldiers that saved the life of His Holiness Dalai Lama. And I very much wanted to go to Kham because no one ever goes there. And traveling in Tibet is a very difficult experience because you're watched, you're followed. It's not like going to India or Japan or Thailand. You know, those are open societies, and Tibet is far more repressive and the much more police presence than central China, same as Xinjiang. So it's very difficult. And we went to Kham, and we went to the great monastery in Chamdo, which had been burnt to the ground twice by CCP soldiers and built again by the Tibetan people. And there were these old monks there who had been tortured and they had broken backs, but when they came out, people flocked to see them. And then I was sitting in a Chinese restaurant. I was with a Tibetan friend from America and with a government-appointed guide and driver who were both Tibetan. And we were just having dinner in a noodle shop, and there was these young people, Tibetan people, talking to us about America, and we hadn't done anything wrong. We were very careful. And then the PSB, the Public Security Bureau, the dreaded secret police of the CCP, they came into the restaurant screaming and shouting, "You have to come down to the police station. You've broken the law." And my first instinct was, okay, this is going to be fun. So we go down there and they said, "You haven't registered." And then there was a Chinese gentleman, older man from Sichuan province. He was smoking and drinking. And the young guards were Tibetan and they were very vicious. It's kind of like what the Nazis did in the concentration camps. The capos in the concentration were Jews who were trained to beat up other Jews. This also happened on slave plantations. It's an old trick of coercion and control of a subject people. So we were held in house arrest overnight, waiting for the general to come decide our fate, the PLA general. And that's when I started getting a little nervous. I go, oh gosh, are we going to be okay? Because there were two guards outside of our hotel door. They wouldn't let us out. And so the next day we were taken back to the police station. We were waiting and waiting. And the guard said, "The general's here." Everybody stood up, pounding of feet. And in walks the PLA general. He's a Tibetan. He's one of the tallest, handsomest Khampa men I've ever seen in my life. And they tend to be very tall and very handsome, Khampa men. Did you see Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon?
Hidden Dragon.
Zanzi, she goes off with the Khampa boy. Well, you know what I mean.
Okay.
And I look at him and he looks at me and our eyes just kind of lock. And we sit down and he starts interrogating us. And my Tibetan was not very good in those days. Thank goodness my Tibetan friend was translating. He said, "What were you doing here? We've been following you." And I said, "Nga nimo gegin yin," which means I'm a painting instructor because I am an artist. And I pulled out all of my paintings. Paintings of Tibetan cultural sites. And so the guns go down, the bayonets go down. They're all looking at my paintings, and then cigarettes come out and tea comes out. We're having a tea party in the jail. And then at one point, again, my eyes lock with the Khampa general. He looks at me and I can tell he knows that I'm working for the Dalai Lama. Why else would I be in this place? You know, it's like we staying in these military hotels. It's very dirty. It's very difficult. I wasn't in Bali, you know, I certainly wasn't in Phuket. And he takes the arrest warrant and he rips it up. And he says to us, "Lhasa dro," which means go to Lhasa now. Because usually what they do is they take all your film, all your notebooks, everything, and they confiscate them. So you have no evidence of your trip. That's happened to many, many, many people I know. And it was remarkable because they'd taken our film, taken it over. He ripped up the arrest warrant and he said, "Go to Lhasa." So we get in the car, we drive. And in those days, there was said to be a hand signal of moving the pinky finger, like in the French Revolution. The French revolutionaries used to use sign language to communicate in the market. And I turned back and I saw him go like this. Now, I don't know if his hand was just moving like that, but I thought, I wonder if he knows. And he's trying to tell us something. And then as we drive away, our guide and our driver, who've been with us for a month now, start crying. And they turn and they look and they say, aren't you working for His Holiness Dalai Lama? And I looked at my friend, I said, let's be honest, it could be a terrible risk, but we said, yes, we are. And said, then I want to show you something. The driver said, my brother was a monk at Drepung Monastery. He was caught with a picture of the Dalai Lama and he was horribly tortured. So as we drove back to Lhasa, it's a 5-day trip, he took us to a safe house outside of Lhasa that was filled with young Tibetan monks who had been tortured. I saw people with eyes that had been gouged out, people's arms had been broken, their fingers had been cut off, some people who couldn't walk because they'd been beaten so badly, their back had been broken, and we're taking pictures wildly, and we could only stay there for about an hour, but I'll never forget that sight of these handsome young men, all crippled and maimed. And then we left the next day for Kathmandu, and our heart was pounding the whole time. Because often what they'll do is they'll watch you to the end in Tibet, and then they'll pull you out of the line, interrogate you, and take all your evidence. But we made it on the plane. We made it back to Kathmandu, and made it back to Washington, where I testified in front of Congress. And I never forgot just like the sense of fear that people live with all the time in Tibet. And the sense of anger that Tibetan people live with as well. And also a lot of the Chinese people that I saw in Tibet, which is so sweet people, you know, forced into intermarriage with the Tibetans to further dilute the Tibetan population, and the Sinification project, you know, forces intermarriage. They're doing this in Xinjiang now too. But I could see that they were very unhappy as well. They didn't want to be up there in the Tibetan plateau. It's a rough, tough place. Only a Tibetan can survive up there in those mountains. They wanted to be back in Sichuan province or Yunnan province, where they were from. And Tibet is the most militarized place I've ever been in my life. I've never seen so much militarization. And of course, all those weapons are now pointing down on South and Southeast Asia, India, Nepal, Thailand, Burma, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and they can hit them all in 20 minutes, because Genghis Khan said, he who controls Tibet controls the world. So that was my most memorable moment.
That's marvelous.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. Next question. How did your parents comment on your life choices?
Well, of course they were supportive, because I was doing something that was very positive and very important, but they were concerned that I was digging myself into a hole, and I would be blackballed and I wouldn't get work. And they were right. They were right. I can't get a job anywhere. You know, the Tibetan movement is so underfunded. And Richard Gere's organization would never take me, because I don't believe that Tibet should be part of China. And Richard Gere runs the International Campaign for Tibet, and they spend so much money on their salaries and their fancy trips, and they don't really do much for the Tibetan people. And they believe Tibet should be part of China. I don't. And so there's really no place to get a job. You have to find, you know, get day jobs. I've done all kinds of crazy things to pay my bills, but I'm frustrated because I would like to be working in an advocacy group where all of my knowledge and experience can go to some good use. But maybe, now that perceptions of China have changed, maybe we Tibet people will have the last laugh after all.
Yeah. Yes.
Thanks to people like you.
Oh,
You know,
thank you. And Miles Guo.
Thank you, Mr. Guo. Thank you. She, Mr. Guo. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay. If you could go back to do it again, how would you do it differently?
I'd marry a millionaire.
Oh.
So I could self-fund my work.
Oh.
But no, that I'm kind of joking. But
yeah,
I've asked myself that question many times, and I guess I wouldn't have done anything differently, because I don't want to have to die with shame. I don't want to have to die and feel ashamed of what I did, that I was working for a regime that has children in concentration camps, that kills poets and kills Buddhist monks, and is now, killing people in Hong Kong, young students in Hong Kong, and has lied to the world about it all. And I want to be on the side of truth. I want to be on the side of the Chinese people, not their tormentors. China is the biggest country in the world. It does matter what kind of government China has. And you hear this from the elite all the time. Oh, why does it matter? If China can be communist, it's its own choice. And I said, it does matter. And I remember the Tiananmen Square massacre, and I don't think the Chinese people want this one-party totalitarian dictatorship. Look at the people in Hong Kong. They've done very, very well under British common law. So don't give me this line that the Chinese people aren't ready for democracy. They're not suited for democracy. They need a strong hand. They need an authoritarian one-party dictatorship. No, they don't. Look at Taiwan. Look at Hong Kong. And so I guess I wouldn't have done it any differently. I didn't know it would be so hard. I didn't know there'd be so much rejection. I didn't know people wouldn't take us seriously. Even when we presented so much evidence, in my congressional testimony, and I'm extraordinarily disappointed with my fellow elites who sold out to the CCP. So no, I'd actually rather be talking to you, my friend Ming, than being at a cocktail party with Bill Clinton and Bill Gates. Because I have been at cocktail parties with Bill Clinton and Bill Gates. Oh, yes, I have. I know all these people. I've met them all. And I'd rather be with you and Mr. Guo and the Dalai Lama any day.
So, Miles Guo and fellow warriors have some questions for you. For example, they'd like to know your feeling and your thoughts when you met His Holiness Dalai Lama. Please share with us, because we don't have that chance yet. Yeah, so we'd like to know.
Well, you can meet him if you go to India. You can go to, many Chinese Buddhist pilgrims are now getting pilgrimage visas to go to India to study with him. He's not traveling so much. But I first met him when I was 19 years old on his first trip to America, which we helped do organizing for. And when you first meet the Dalai Lama, it's impossible not to be deeply moved by how beautiful he is and his radiant aura. He has the most beautiful hands I've ever seen. And he's also a very humble and a very kind person. As he said when he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989 as a reaction to the Tiananmen Square massacre, the one time the Nobel Peace Prize got it right, and also, they haven't always got it right, they did then. He said, "I'm a simple Buddhist monk, no more, no less." And he always says that he wants peace with the Chinese government. And he wants to go back to Tibet one day. I'll tell you a very interesting story. It's in his book. It's translated into Chinese as well, and many languages. He wrote it in 1963, 64, after the India-China-Tibet War, and he was a young refugee in India. It's called My Land and My People.
Yeah.
And I was looking for a copy of it. I don't know, maybe I lent it to someone. It's my favorite book about Tibet. If you want to read anything, start with that book. It's not a long book. And there was a plot to assassinate him in Lhasa in 1959 by inviting him to a puppet show. And they'd used this trick, the CCP, many times. They said, you can come to the puppet show, you can't bring your bodyguards. And the High Lama would step into the tent for the puppet show, an assassin would come from behind the curtain and slit their neck. Wow. So he was invited to this puppet show, and his bodyguard said, you can't go, you mustn't, they'll kill you. So he went into his shrine in the Nobunaga Palace, which I've seen in Lhasa. It's incredibly beautiful. And he prayed before Jigje Yamantaka, his protector, and said, what do I do? And the oracle, Nechung oracle, which is a Tibetan monk, went into a trance and channeled the spirit of Nechung and said, you have to go to India now, right now. So His Holiness prayed for two things: a safe escape to India, and one day, a return to Tibet. And last time I saw him in Dharamsala a couple years ago, he pulled me aside. He said, Maura, my Tibetan doctor says I'm going to outlive the CCP. And I said,
Oh,
that's good news, Your Holiness. I'm so happy to hear that.
yeah. So am
So you
I.
may have a chance to meet him one day.
Okay. Hopefully, yeah. Okay. Also, our fellow warriors like to know how you, yeah, um, to just tell us how your view about Nixon and Kissinger's Chinese policy.
Oh, well, I've known Henry Kissinger since I was very, very young, because he and my father were both professors at Harvard together in the government department. And his daughter was in my school in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a lovely lady. And Dr. Kissinger is still alive. And we interviewed him for a film I produced about my father. And I see him, you know, from time to time at functions in New York. And he and my father were colleagues. They were never friends. And I think the Kissinger doctrine has obviously been a terrible, terrible failure. I've always wanted to say that to Dr. Kissinger, but you know, I think unless I could really get him alone in a room, you know, why bother at doing it at a New York function? But there's a very interesting memo from Nixon, where Nixon said, you know, we don't want to isolate China because there's a danger to that, but we want to bring China into the family of nations to hope that they will transform their political system and they will evolve. But Kissinger had a different view. Kissinger's view is, let's just use them to contain the Soviet Union, let them keep their communist system if they want. And Nixon gets blamed for the Kissinger doctrine, because Nixon did also appointed my father ambassador to India, which transformed Indian-American relations, which had been stalled for a very long time because Kissinger created the tilt to Pakistan in the Bangladesh War of Independence in 1971. 1971, Bangladesh was East Pakistan, and there was a liberation movement, and West Pakistan was extremely brutal to the Bangladeshi people, the people of what was part of Bengal before partition. And my father went on television in Boston and excoriated the Pakistani government for this. And Richard Nixon saw this and said, I want you to be my ambassador to India to correct the imbalance between the world's largest democracy, India, and the world's richest democracy, America. And my father did that. So, you know, Richard Nixon history's treating him kinder as they look back, you know, after the Watergate thing. But I think the Kissinger doctrine was a disaster. And what I've noticed is that after the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and after Mikhail Gorbachev allowed the peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union, which was one of the great events in history, he was my hero, Mikhail Gorbachev. He's still alive. He's one person I would hope to meet one day. He lives in Russia. And the rationale for the Kissinger doctrine was gone, because the whole purpose of building up China was to contain the Soviet Union. Well, there's no Soviet Union anymore, but our China policy continued just as it was, which is special relationship, special engagement. Don't criticize them, you know, don't talk about political reform, any of those things. And that turned out to be catastrophic, because now we have the CCP virus infecting the world, and the CCP will not share information. They won't allow doctors and scientists into Wuhan to try to find out where this virus came from. They've expelled American journalists. I notice also that the CCP ambassadors all over the world are becoming extremely bellicose and extremely vicious. Did you hear what the CCP ambassador to Canada just said? He said, Canada's taking all of our medical supplies, so they're good little boys, but America isn't, so America's evil. They're trying to divide Canada and America, two allies with an uncontested border in North America. And the French ambassador and the British ambassador in London, and the ambassador in Washington, he's a charming fellow. He's so CCP. And these guys have fooled So many elitists, because, you know, they have cufflinks and they have a nice tie and they have a Savile Row suit, and, you know, when they play tennis and have a cocktail. So they don't dress like the Maoists I saw when I went to the PRC in 1995. But behind all the fancy clothes and the French cufflinks, they're hardcore Maoists, right? All of your Guo media people know that. But how come the elite doesn't know that? But even worse, do they not care? Do they think it's okay to be a Marxist and a Maoist? That's a real question I want to ask them. Which side are you on? Are you on the side of democracy and human rights? Are you on the side of the Hong Kong protesters? Are you on the side of Xi Jinping and Chairman Mao?
What do you think are the reason for them to take the side of the CCP?
That's a good question. I've asked myself that question almost every day of my life. Why? I think it's probably a combination of three things. Again, let's not forget the wonderful Jim Mann's important book, The China Fantasy, required reading. He said it was his worst-selling book. I've bought about 50 copies, give them to people. He said there's three scenarios that Western elites use to explain away communist China's crimes against humanity and their atrocities. One is that, if we just give them enough money and they drink enough Coca-Cola, they'll change one day. Well, that hasn't happened. And then there's another theory, which is rather alarming, which is let them be communists as long as we can make money with them. So why did we fight the Cold War? And also, this is a very important book. If you really want to understand how the elites in this country think about communist China, read Doing Business in China for Dummies. And you have to be a dummy to buy this book. I just want to read you one little passage of this book, which explains so much. I mean, if I was a Chinese person, I would be so insulted by this book. And again, it's the project of Chang Shanghai, the American Chamber of Commerce. This is just absolutely disgusting. Behaving yourself in Chinese company. The Chinese people are known to be very humble, but they can also lose their temper quickly. So don't talk about controversial subjects. Avoid bringing up the subjects of politics, religion, Taiwan, the Dalai Lama, and Falun Gong. And one reason I know that this is probably the work of the CCP is they don't spell the Dalai Lama's name right. They spell it the way the CCP spells it, D-A-L-I. And it just says, you know, there's also a little chapter in here about the Cultural Revolution. That is sickening. Sickening. It's called Send in the Red Guards. Send in the Red Guards. God, this book really is for dummies, isn't it? Okay. And it said, a lot of people were killed in the Cultural Revolution. People had grudges against each other, tagged their enemies as counter-revolutionary, even if it wasn't true, and ended up being killed by a mob. Family members testified against their own blood and kin to protect themselves. The Cultural Revolution ended in 1976, but its effects lingered today. But Deng Xiaoping came along and saved the day, and everything's okay now. I mean, how is that acceptable? How is that acceptable to the Chinese people? But see, reading those kinds of books tells you a lot about their mindset. Sweep all these atrocities under the rug because you can make money. And that book is also full of very, very insulting references to, like, labor costs here are cheaper than anywhere else because it's slave labor. Doesn't say that. And the Chinese people aren't very well educated. So you can really get them to work harder because they don't know about labor laws. That's right in that book. So I think also, back to your original question, it's just greed. And it's just this short-sighted idea that profits are the only thing that matters and that money matters more than morality. I said this to the Dalai Lama in 2009. I was in Dharamshala and I warned him that he was going to get sold out by the Obama administration. And sure enough, he was when Obama didn't meet him. And I said that the CCP is using the financial crisis as much as it can to squeeze the West and get concessions out of the West. And he leaned back in his chair and he looked disappointed and he said, yes, money is going to overrule morality. I think it's as simple as that. Which side are you on? Are you on the side of the Chinese people or on the side of their killers? It's pretty simple.
Yeah, greediness.
Yeah, and stupidity and lack of morality, you know. Lack of and not caring about other people's children, you know. Oh, some Chinese people got killed, Tibetan people got killed, though it's not my clan. Who cares? You know, and now Americans are being killed because of the CCP. Now it's here, and the man in the street has an unfavorable view of the CCP, but the elites are still defending them. So our work isn't over. We still have a lot of work to do in the exposed revolution.
Yes, indeed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
So,
those dummies books, there's a bunch of them about China. Read them and just like laugh. They're insulting. I want Chinese people to read them because, and these guys live in China. A lot of them have Chinese wives, you know, and they probably mistreat their poor Chinese wives. I've met these AmCham guys. They're very racist also, you know. They like using slave labor. Well, it's fine with me, you know, and it's unacceptable. It's morally unacceptable. But I do believe in karma, and you know what they say about karma.
Yeah.
Pay now or pay later.
The CCP wants to finish and Hong Kong protests for good. So what is your advice to Hong Kong protesters?
Oh, this is very, very, very upsetting. Because I think, as we discussed last time, my fear is that with the West engulfed in the CCP virus, that the PLA can march on Hong Kong and shoot people in the streets and get away with it. Last summer, I was having lots of arguments with people. They said, oh, they don't dare shoot the protesters in Hong Kong. You know, Hong Kong's too important financially. I said, you wait, you watch, they will. Remember Tiananmen Square? They had no problem killing the students then in front of the whole world. And if they do start killing the innocent people of Hong Kong who've been so brave and so extraordinary and the freedom fighters of our time and my heroes, and I did lots of art. I just want to share this one painting I did. No, it's a collage. It's a collage. Can you see it? I don't know. I'm trying to tip it. Yeah, wait. Sorry. Don't make me kill my brother. Because I believe that the Chinese people don't want to kill each other. And I have the Hong Kong protesters here. Hong Kong, guns drawn, let there be light. Because this picture went viral all over Asia of a young PLA soldier crying. And that's, of course, from the Cultural Revolution. Someone being shot in the back. Commie style. Commies are cowards. You know, tie someone up and shoot him in the back. That's classy. You know, so I believe that if they shoot people in Hong Kong next week, a lot of people could die. And we should at least be at the ready to report about it, if that's all we can do. My father once said to me about my Tibet work, he said, if you cannot prevent a genocide, you can at least expose it. And I want you to use that with the exposed revolution. Use that phrase. Yeah. So I think my message to the Hong Kong people is that you are not forgotten. We are watching. We will at least do everything we can to make sure you don't die in vain. And I would like to see the British government give the Hong Kong people British passports.
Yeah.
You know, because then they would have some measure of protection, right?
Yeah. Rights of abode. Yeah, indeed. And what can the American do, according to you? You know, we have the American legislature passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, but however, so far it hasn't been enforced. So that means it hasn't taken effect. So what should we do with that?
Well, unfortunately, as you and I have discussed, the passage of a resolution isn't the same as action. You know, it means that the government knows there's a problem in Hong Kong. They know that there's violations of free speech and that there's police brutality, and that on
People
paper,
die.
yeah, on paper we stand with Hong Kong. But what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
I haven't read the act completely. I've read some of the basics of it. But does that mean if the Hong Kong people get shot and killed by the PLA, the American army is going to go in? Or NATO troops are going to go in? I don't know, and we'll have to see. And I think I would ask my American friends who now have a negative view of the CCP, which they didn't have 2 months ago. It took the CCP virus, the pandemic, to make people wake up to the deaths of our fellow Americans, to watch Hong Kong carefully, because this is how the CCP rolls. They lie, they break their promises. They called it the peaceful liberation of Tibet once upon a time, when they killed nearly 2 million people in Tibet. You know, one country, two systems. Oh yeah, really? No, don't see that working out. I think we have to watch and wait. Maybe it's a good time to flood the United Nations with letters. But I don't have a lot of faith for the United Nations. Here's another thing I want to share. My father's book, A Dangerous Place, about the United Nations. It's my favorite book he ever wrote, because it when he was ambassador, United States ambassador to the UN, the Soviet Union teamed up with a lot of Arab states to pass a resolution declaring Zionism a form of racism, which was a way to destroy Israel. And unfortunately, it really did have an effect of making Israel become a pariah and become hardline. And it sort of set the stage that totalitarian dictatorships can control the UN, which was created out of the ashes of the Holocaust. The UN was only created after World War II, after 6 million European Jews were killed. And so now I see the CCP taking over the UN. They just took over the Human Rights Council of the UN.
And WHO.
What? I'm sorry?
WHO.
Yeah. So I have my friend Anders Kaur, whom you should interview. He actually lives in England. He's American, absolutely brilliant. He has a great idea, which I encourage people to think about. We have in America legally the right to deny Chinese diplomats access to the United Nations because it's American soil. So we can prevent them from going into the United Nations building. Why don't we enforce that?
Good idea. So it's about the CCP's infiltration into the international organizations. You think about it, it's terrible. It's terrible. Not just the Human Rights Council, but also WHO.
Yeah.
WHO. Thinking about that devastating impact. WHO. What has it done for this coronavirus? It's absolutely perfect CCP collaborator.
Yeah,
what can you say?
Well, Dr. Tedros is a Maoist from Ethiopia, and he's very inarticulate. His English is very, very poor. I've seen him speak. I had to struggle to listen to what he said. He's not even a doctor. And he was the previous head of the WHO was a Chinese communist, a woman. I'm forgetting her name.
Margaret Chan. She's a Hong Kong native, but she's handpicked by the CCP. So she's a CCP running dog.
Yeah.
And she then picked this Tedros as her successor, because the CCP wants to be sure that it has full control over the WHO. So it's all started from Margaret Chan, and now her successor, Tedros. So this is absolutely terrible. And according to Miles Guo's exposure, the WHO has very, very close partnership with the P4 lab in Wuhan, as well as the P3 lab in Hong Kong. It is very shocking. It's shocking. It is shocking. So my school said, just wait. The truth will come out. how the Hong Kong CCP running dog and the military force working in P4 lab in Wuhan and the WHO, how they have collaborated, to drag the whole world into this coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah, they have. No, it's shocking beyond belief. And I absolutely supported President Trump when he said America was going to suspend funding to the WHO. And of course, all the liberal class went crazy. And Nicholas Kristof, who is a New York Times columnist, wrote this scathing column about how Trump's crazy and this is madness and we need the WHO. Oh, really? I guess Mr. Kristof hasn't had anybody got infected with the virus yet in his family. And, it's like, you see all these, sanctimonious columns coming out of the liberal elite. Well, Mr. Kristof also wants to protect his access to China. He wants to make sure that he gets a visa to go to China, like the Harvard professor who flunked me when I wrote that China was a police state in 1975. So I think the United Nations, we don't, this book, we'll go into it further in another interview. I want to take some passages that my father wrote about the future of the UN and how it is at risk from totalitarian influence and infiltration. And the founders of the United Nations certainly didn't want communist China to run the place. And I'll tell you another sad story. In the mid-50s, India was offered a seat on the Security Council. Pandit Nehru, the Prime Minister of India. And he had this grand vision of an Asian century post the colonial order. And there was this program called Hindi Chini Bye Bye, which means Indian-Chinese friendship. Turned out to be one of the great blunders of history. And Tibet was lost through it. And you know what Pandit Nehru did? He called Chairman Mao, his good friend, and said, they've offered me a seat on the Security Council. I didn't want to take it without asking you if it was okay. And Mao said, no, don't do that. You can't do that. It's bad. Those are a bunch of Europeans. So he didn't. And the minute the Chinese got a chance to get on the Security Council, boom, they're right there. And India does not have a seat on the Security Council. Democratic India is denied representation. Communist China has a seat right up there with all the other European countries in America. So I think that I don't know how to do house cleaning at the UN. America's the biggest donor. And I think that Dr. Anders Kaur has the most practical solution to how to send the CCP a message. Let's deny their diplomats access to the UN headquarters in New York. By law, we can do that.
Practical.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Yeah. Yes.
Can you imagine the look on their faces? Can you imagine the look on their faces? Oh, I'll tell you another little story. When I was promoting our film about Palden Gyatso, the monk, the Tibetan monk who spent 33 years in a CCP prison, in the summer of 2008, summer of the Beijing Olympics, there was a conference about genocide at the United Nations. And I live in New York City, not far from the UN building on First Avenue. And I had a friend who worked at the American mission because my dad had been ambassador to the United Nations. And so I called and I said, could I have 2 passes to attend the genocide conference? And she said, sure, they'll be waiting for you. So I went there with Palden, who is a Tibetan monk. So he wears the same robes as His Holiness Dalai Lama. And being a Tibetan, he looks like the Dalai Lama too. So we walked in to the General Assembly building, where I've been many, many times, especially when Dad was ambassador there. And there were just swarms of Chinese delegations. There always are. They're everywhere. And they looked at me with Palden, and they came towards us like they were going to try to kill us or beat us. And we just stood there and stared at them. And when they came up, I went, Tashi Dele, which is how you say hello in Tibetan. And they stared and they glowered, and we waved at them. And then I took Palden by the hand really hard, and we marched into the conference room where the genocide conference was taking place. And we sat there, and they came and they stared at us. And when Q&A came, we asked a very tough question about Tibet, and we put pictures of torture. But that's what happens at the UN. I think I'm the only person who'd ever do that. The Dalai Lama is not allowed to set foot in the UN. He can't.
No.
But I was able to bring Palden Gyatso, thank goodness. And here's another one of my artworks.
Yeah.
Where I have Palden's picture right here.
Yes.
In the kind of chained handcuffs and thumb cuffs they put him in. And here's Big Bill Clinton. And here's Mitch McConnell, who's married to the daughter of a PLA general. He's the head of the United States Senate, senator from Kentucky, Republican from Kentucky. There's Obama with Papa Xi having a banquet. And I say, gee, it's fun to make friends with people from other cultures. And here it says, remember when they said Coca-Cola would bring democracy? That was a good one. Because it didn't. It didn't. And all of these people who've sold out to the CCP, they should be ashamed of themselves. And we're not hearing anything from the big CC apologists right now. Haven't heard anything from the Clintons. Or haven't heard anything from the Obamas. Haven't heard anything from the Schwartzmans and the Bloombergs. And I know Mitch McConnell's in a lot of trouble because he's in the same party as President Trump. They're both Republicans. But Mitch McConnell's wife, Elaine Chao, who was in the cabinet of George W. Bush, she's CCP, big time. She made Mitch a rich man. So he must be very torn in his loyalties. Must be tough at the Chao McConnell household over dinner right now.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
You got all that. All right.
Keep track of these people, Ming. I follow them. I follow what they say, what they do. All you have to do is go and see how many trips they've taken to China, with this company, with that company, and see the things they say. They will never talk about the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, the Hong Kong people. They let the Hong Kong people go. Well, if Hong Kong starts to bleed next week, if they kill people, the PLA shoots people next week in Hong Kong, I think what we should do is create a truth pledge to send to all of the appeasers and ask them if they acknowledge what they saw in Hong Kong. Do they acknowledge that that was slaughter of the innocents? And ask them which side are they on? Of the side of the Hong Kong people or the side of the CCP killers? Pretty simple question.
Yeah. So, so far, we have heard many suicides occurred in Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. Detained protesters were reported raped, gang raped, or sodomy. Mm-hmm. And also days ago, it was reported that from an unverified source that some detained Hong Kong protesters were transferred to Xinjiang, to mainland China. So mm-hmm. Do you believe these stories?
Oh, absolutely. Because I spent so many years interviewing Tibetan political prisoners who'd survived as PLA torture and CCP prisons. I know how they do it. I absolutely believe it. And I also heard last summer through my own sources that Hong Kong protesters were being shipped to Xinjiang, to the concentration camps. And that brings me to another little exhibition here. This gentleman, my friend, Chen Guangkou. Chen Guangkou was governor of Tibet. He was put in after the Beijing Olympics and the Tibetan protesters who embarrassed the CCP with their anti-CCP protests. He was brought in to really crack down hard. He did such a good job that Papa Xi sent him to Xinjiang in 2016. So we're hearing more about the concentration camp system in Xinjiang because it's newer and it's more high tech, but it started in Tibet. And nobody reads about Tibet anymore. Nobody reports about Tibet. You never hear about Tibet. Tibet's disappeared. It's like it's dead. It's gone. But Chen Guangkou is a CCP killer. And I bet you he said, send all those Hong Kong people here to me. I will torture them good and plenty. So I follow the CCP too. I follow them. I read about them. I read about where they came from. Li Peng, Hu Jintao, Zhu Rongji, Xi Jinping, all of them. And Carrie Lam is one of my favorites. She drives me completely crazy. you know, but she seems to me to be very weak. She's just Papa Xi's lapdog, isn't she?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Definitely.
She's Papa Xi's poodle.
Mm.
And not even a very good looking poodle either, you know.
Unfortunately, no. No.
No.
Yeah. So next one. Have you heard anything? Tell us something about the past and the current lives of the Tibetans in China. So you talk about that the Tibetans, yeah, many Tibetans had been tortured, raped, and abused by the CCP, right? And also there's a pedophile ring run by Wang Qishan. So could you share the stories with us?
Well, a lot of these stories are verified by survivors who managed to get out. You know, they were released from prison. They crossed the Himalayas into Nepal and then came into India. And Palden Gyatso made many trips around the world with his book and his film. But then there are lots of them that are just living in India. And you can go interview them. And we've collected a lot of this evidence. And the situation right now in Tibet is a very, very difficult one because there's just so many spies. And they recruit Tibetans to spy on each other. You know, that's the old CCP playbook. You know, get families to inform on each other. And my friends, European friends, have been able to go to Tibet fairly recently. No one's going now with the virus, but went last year. Said it's just so militarized and you can't step out of line for a minute. So a lot of Tibetans have made the decision, a practical decision, that they have to Sinify or die. They have to give up speaking Tibetan. They have to learn Mandarin. They have to take a Chinese wife or husband. They have to join the Communist Party or they'll die. And I can understand the need to survive. I can understand the need that to just not live in fear all the time. And even if you join the CCP, you live in fear. And of course, conditions for political prisoners remain terrible, but they've been terrible for 70 years. Tibet has been a war zone for 70 years since the PLA marched in. And at Radio Free Asia, where I used to work, we still get stories of political prisoners who are released. There was one just a few days ago of a Tibetan monk who was caught with a little picture of the Dalai Lama. He was beaten so badly that when he was released from prison, what they often do is they torture you and they beat you to the point where you're going to die anyway. But they release you so you die in your family's care to send a message to your family that this is what will happen to you if you step out of line. It's so extraordinarily brutal and inhumane and cruel. And that's why Tibet is so important to study. Because if you want to know the grotesque details of how the CCP tortures people and abuses people and raping women with electric cattle prods. Palden had an electric cattle prod put into his mouth. He lost all his teeth. We describe it in the film. You know, they cut your hands off little by little, the death of 1,000 cuts, and hanging people up and beating them for hours and hours. And, you know, we've documented all of this. But it just didn't seem to matter, now did it? To the Bill Gateses and the Tim Cooks and the Bill Clintons of the world. They just turned a blind eye to it. You know, and that meant they were colluding with torture. That meant their hands are covered in blood. And if they sit back and they do not act or support the people of Hong Kong, then it's more blood. I am so disgusted with the elites of this country for their warm embrace of the CCP. Well, I don't think it's going to end well here either, because they've got their spies all over this country as well.
Yeah.
I mean, Tibet is so far away. And Tibet is very important to the CCP because it has resources, water, minerals, land. But America is very important to them because it has high tech, and it's the global hegemon. So I tell people, you want to know who you're dealing with when you do business with the CCP, study Tibet.
Yeah.
Study Tibet. And then tell me if you really want to work with these people. A lot of people have unfriended me for this, you know. I don't get invited to certain cocktail parties because, you know, I'll tell you another story, interesting story about the CCP, how it co-ops elites. You know, the United Front Work Department, that's their mission, is to co-opt Western elites. It's been incredibly successful, incredibly successful. The Confucius Institutes, it was all part of the United Front, right?
Yeah.
So last year I was in England and I went to Oxford to interview Sir Chris Patten, the last colonial governor.
Yeah. Yes.
I
last
love
governor.
Yes. He's a great friend of Hong Kong. Chris Patten is a great friend of Hong Kong. And he and Ben Rogers of Hong Kong Watch are always speaking out and always raising the issue of Hong Kong. So the people of Hong Kong are not forgotten, thanks to people like Chris Patten and Ben Rogers and myself. So anyway, I was visiting a friend at one of the colleges, and I was invited to the high table dinner, which is a great ritual. You put on the robes and stuff. And the friend who took me said, Maura, I got to tell you, one of our big donors who just gave 15 million quid to the side business school is going to be there. And he's Chinese, and he's in Singapore, though. We vetted him, so he's probably not CCP. And I went, oh, you think just because somebody lives in Singapore, they're not CCP? They've got CCP people in New York City. They've got the CCP all over the world. He said, I understand more, but please don't say anything about Tibet or Hong Kong or Xinjiang. Please don't embarrass all of us. And I said, I can't promise that. It's too good an opportunity to be breaking bread with a bunch of CCP billionaires at Oxford University. He said, I'll try to keep it light, but I can't promise you I won't say anything. And he's very nervous. So I'm wondering if their spies were out there, because we arrive and there's a little reception before the dinner. And I'm forgetting the name of this fellow. I'll have to go back and get it for you. But he got a big entourage with him, and he was I could tell he was CCP the minute I met him. You know how I can always tell? There's a coldness in the soul and the eyes. So I'm shaking hands with everyone. I go up to him. He won't shake my hand. He
knew who you were.
He knew who I was. He wouldn't shake my hand. I went, ni hao. I went, hello. And he just looked at me with hate. Everybody saw it. So I just smiled. And then one of his young friends went out for a cigarette. So I went out with him. I said, can I have a cigarette? And so I said, gee whiz, I've been reading the Xinjiang papers. And isn't it terrible? They're torturing children in concentration camps. What do you think about that? He started shaking. He said, well, it's for the good of the country. I said, really? Don't you think it's bad karma to torture children? And he started shaking. I said, you told me earlier you're a Buddhist. I said, I'm a Buddhist too. What about your next life? Aren't you worried? At this point, he's almost a puddle on the sidewalk, right? And the cigarette was finished. We go back in. And so then during the dinner, they're all staring at me with hate. Hate. And I'm just a smile back, you know.
You had a good time.
Cheers. Have some Guinness. I love doing that. That's how I have fun. That's how I entertain myself.
Okay.
I don't think I'll get asked back to Oxford in a long, long time.
Yeah, because Oxford is very pro-Beijing.
Yeah,